Today, I stand before you not only as the president of our great nation, but as a representative of the voices of millions who have long been unheard and sidelined in the global economic arena. It is with a sense of urgency and a deep sense of responsibility that I address you today, as we face a time of unprecedented challenges and unprecedented opportunity. The International Monetary Fund, an institution born from the vision of a more stable and prosperous global economy, must evolve. And I say this without reservation. We cannot afford to continue along the same path that has seen so many nations, particularly in the global south, burdened by debt, shackled by the weight of structural adjustments that have only exacerbated inequality, and left to struggle in a system that, frankly, was never designed with their prosperity in mind. The West has long dominated the economic discourse, setting the rules and dictating the terms. But today, I challenge that status quo. The time has come to redefine the relationship between the IMF and the nations it serves. The time has come to confront the uncomfortable truth that the economic policies that have been imposed upon us have often been not just ineffective, but harmful. We are told that austerity is the solution, that cutting social spending and limiting public investment will lead to growth. Yet we look around and we see poverty, unemployment, and inequality growing ever more entrenched. This is not growth, this is a mirage. And it is a mirage that has been sold to us as progress, a progress that benefits only a select few while the majority continue to struggle. No longer will we accept a future where our people suffer to maintain a system that serves the interests of the few. No longer will we remain passive in the face of policies that have done nothing but deepen our vulnerabilities. Our nations have the right to define our own paths to development. We will not be dictated to any longer. Our children deserve better than the shackles of debt repayment that drain resources from education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Our farmers deserve better than the free market policies that open their markets to global competition while failing to protect them from the consequences of volatility and exploitation. The West may be shocked by the boldness of this speech, but the truth is we are no longer in the position of meekly accepting what is handed down to us. The world has changed. It is no longer the case that the voices of the global south can be ignored or suppressed. We demand fairer lending terms, a new approach to debt restructuring, and greater investment in sustainable development that does not come at the expense of our sovereignty. We call for an IMF that listens to the realities of our nations and works with us, not as a force of external control, but as a partner in our shared prosperity. We demand a world where the global south has a seat at the table, not as a token, but as an equal. To the Western powers that may feel threatened by this call for change, I say this: change is not a threat, it is a necessity. The future of the global economy depends on the voices and contributions of all nations, not just the powerful few. If we are to truly address the issues of inequality, climate change, and global instability, we must work together, not as masters and subordinates, but as equals in pursuit of a better future for all. The time for empty promises and half-hearted reforms has passed. We will not accept the status quo any longer. We will not remain passive in the face of injustice. Our nations are ready to stand on their own 2 feet, to embrace the opportunities that come with sovereignty, and to build an economy that benefits all our people, not just the elites. Let this be a turning point in the history of global economic governance. Let it be the moment when the IMF recognizes that it must adapt to the needs of the many, not the few. And let it be the moment when the voices of the global south rise, not in submission, but in power. For far too long, the global economic system has been shaped and dominated by a small group of Western powers. These countries, through their financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, have set the rules for how global economic governance should work, often at the expense of nations in the global south. While the West enjoys the benefits of their economic dominance, developing nations continue to face systemic obstacles that hinder their growth and perpetuate cycles of poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. The policies promoted by these global institutions have historically favored the economic interests of the wealthiest countries, often overlooking or outright exploiting the needs and aspirations of poorer nations. The IMF, for example, has frequently imposed harsh austerity measures and structural adjustment programs on countries in the global south, claiming these measures are necessary for stabilizing national economies and ensuring long-term growth. However, the reality has been far different. Austerity measures, such as cutting public spending, reducing social services, and implementing wage freezes, often exacerbate the very conditions they are supposed to address. Instead of fostering sustainable economic growth, these policies deepen social divides, increase poverty, and lead to widespread social unrest. While the IMF promises these reforms will lead to recovery and prosperity, the evidence has consistently shown that they disproportionately harm vulnerable populations, particularly the poor, women, and marginalized communities. These policies also impose an unrealistic expectation that developing countries should rapidly open their markets to global competition, regardless of the local context or readiness. In many cases, this has led to the collapse of local industries and the loss of vital public services. For example, in some African nations, austerity has resulted in cuts to education and healthcare budgets, undermining the very foundations needed to build a skilled, healthy, and productive workforce. Similarly, the liberalization of markets has allowed multinational corporations to dominate local economies, often at the expense of small-scale farmers, local businesses, and indigenous industries. Moreover, these programs do not account for the unique challenges faced by the Global South, many of which are rooted in historical factors, such as colonialism, resource extraction, and underdevelopment. The economic systems that have shaped the West were built on the backs of enslaved peoples and colonized nations. Yet the IMF's policies rarely take into account the lingering effects of colonialism, such as entrenched inequalities, weak institutions, and dependence on exporting raw materials. Instead of focusing on long-term structural reforms that address these underlying causes of inequality, the IMF often promotes quick-fix solutions that ignore the deeper needs of developing nations. This approach only reinforces the global economic divide. The time has come to challenge this outdated paradigm. The current system simply does not work for the majority of the world's population, particularly in the Global South. It is no longer acceptable for a small group of wealthy nations to continue dictating the terms of global economic governance, while the vast majority of the world's countries are left to pick up the pieces. This system has proven time and again that it is not designed to benefit everyone. It serves the interests of a few, leaving billions of people trapped in cycles of poverty, inequality, and debt. It's clear that this model is broken, and it is time to push for a new economic order, one that prioritizes fairness, justice, and shared prosperity for all. To do so, we must challenge the very foundations of global economic governance. We must demand a system where decisions are made collectively, where the voices of the Global South are heard, and where the interests of all nations, not just the wealthiest few, are represented. Instead, it must embrace a holistic approach to development, one that invests in human capital, builds strong institutions, and ensures that every nation has the tools it needs to thrive. The new economic order must center on fairness. Fairness in trade agreements so that nations in the Global South are not subjected to exploitative practices by multinational corporations. Fairness in debt restructuring so that countries burdened with unsustainable debt can rebuild without sacrificing essential public services. Fairness in investment, so that developing countries receive the financial support they need to invest in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and sustainable industries that will provide long-term benefits for their citizens. At the heart of this new economic order must be shared prosperity. Prosperity is not just about growing GDP or increasing exports. It is about ensuring that the benefits of economic growth are distributed equitably so that no one is left behind. It is about creating opportunities for people in the Global South to improve their lives, to have access to quality education, to receive affordable health care, and to live in safe and thriving communities. Shared prosperity is about building a future where wealth and resources are not concentrated in the hands of a few, but are distributed in a way that enables every citizen to fulfill their potential. The path forward will not be easy. The entrenched power structures that govern the global economy will resist change, as they have for decades, but the need for reform is undeniable. The Global South is no longer willing to accept the status quo. It is time to challenge the outdated economic model that has only served to perpetuate inequality and to demand a system that works for everyone. If we truly want a more stable, just, and prosperous world, we must build a new economic order that is rooted in fairness, equity, and shared opportunity for all. For decades, austerity has been sold as the ultimate solution to the economic problems faced by nations in the Global South. The narrative promoted by Western powers and institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, tells a story of economic stability and growth through fiscal restraint, cutting government spending, reducing public services, and slashing social welfare programs. The idea is simple: balance the budget, reduce deficits, and restore investor confidence. However, the reality of austerity has been far from this promised land of prosperity. Instead of ushering in economic recovery, austerity has caused widespread suffering, exacerbated inequality, and perpetuated cycles of poverty and unemployment. The impact of these policies has been devastating for many nations, particularly in the Global South, and it is time for the world to reject them in favor of a more equitable and sustainable approach to development. Austerity at its core is a philosophy that places the burden of economic recovery on the shoulders of ordinary citizens. By slashing public spending, governments are forced to cut essential services like healthcare, education, and social welfare. These cuts disproportionately affect the most vulnerable members of society, those who rely on public services to survive and thrive. In many countries that have implemented austerity measures under the guidance of the IMF, we have seen a direct rise in poverty rates, a decline in public health outcomes, and a deepening of social divides. The very institutions meant to protect and uplift the people have been systematically dismantled, leaving the poor and working class communities to bear the brunt of the economic fallout. One of the most glaring examples of the failure of austerity is the case of Greece, where austerity measures were rigorously imposed following the 2008 global financial crisis. Greece was forced to implement severe cuts to public spending, leading to mass unemployment, a collapse of the healthcare system, and the erosion of basic public services. While the IMF and the European Union insisted that these measures were necessary to stabilize the economy and reduce debt, the reality was far different. Greece's GDP shrank dramatically, poverty levels soared, and unemployment reached historic highs, particularly among young people. Instead of reviving the economy, austerity deepened the crisis and pushed the country into a prolonged recession that lasted for years. The people of Greece and other countries subjected to similar measures were told that austerity was the price of economic recovery. However, what they experienced was the opposite: an economic disaster that led to widespread despair. The false promise of austerity is built on the assumption that cutting government spending will somehow lead to increased growth. But this assumption overlooks the reality that public spending is essential for stimulating demand and supporting the economy, particularly in times of crisis. When governments slash spending on public services, they are essentially taking money out of the economy, money that would otherwise circulate and support businesses, create jobs, and improve the livelihoods of ordinary people. In the absence of government investment, private sector growth is often insufficient to fill the gap, particularly in developing economies where the private sector is weak or underdeveloped. Moreover, austerity policies often lead to a vicious cycle of debt. Countries subjected to IMF-imposed austerity measures are often required to take on more loans to finance the costs of implementing these policies. The loans come with high interest rates and strict repayment conditions, which only increase the country's debt burden. As debt levels rise, governments are forced to cut even more public spending in order to meet their debt obligations, which in turn deepens the economic crisis. This cycle of debt, austerity, and recession traps nations in a state of perpetual economic stagnation, making it almost impossible to achieve long-term growth or prosperity. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of austerity is the false narrative it promotes. The IMF and other Western financial institutions have long maintained that austerity measures are necessary for countries to get their fiscal house in order and return to a path of economic growth. This narrative presents austerity as a form of economic discipline, a necessary step for nations to prove their worthiness for international investment and economic stability. However, this narrative ignores the reality that austerity disproportionately harms the most vulnerable populations, while often failing to address the root causes of economic instability. It is a narrative that is convenient for the powerful, but devastating for the people who bear the cost. The focus on austerity also diverts attention away from more effective solutions to economic challenges, such as investing in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and sustainable development. Rather than slashing public spending, governments should be focusing on policies that promote inclusive growth and social welfare. This includes investing in human capital, providing access to education and healthcare, building a skilled workforce, and addressing inequality. Investments in infrastructure, such as clean energy, transportation, and digital connectivity, can also stimulate economic growth and create long-term jobs. These policies not only benefit the economy as a whole, but they also improve the lives of ordinary people, creating a more just and equitable society. The time has come to reject the harmful economic policies of austerity and embrace a new vision for development, one that prioritizes people over profits, social welfare over fiscal restraint, and long-term sustainability over short-term fixes. Austerity is not the answer to the problems facing the Global South. It is a failed policy that has caused immeasurable harm and will continue to do so as long as it remains in place. Instead of continuing down this destructive path, we must work together to build an economic system that benefits everyone, not just the wealthy few. Real sustainable development is not achieved by cutting essential services or forcing nations into perpetual debt. It is achieved through investment in people, in infrastructure, in institutions, and in the future. It is time to challenge the false narrative of austerity and pursue an approach that works for everyone, an approach that builds a more just, equitable, and prosperous world for all. The promise of growth should not be based on the suffering of the many, but on the well-being of all people, regardless of their nation, class, or background. This is the path forward, one of true progress, not empty promises. For too long, nations in the Global South have been forced to navigate their development paths under the weight of external pressures and imposed policies. These countries have been treated as passive recipients of aid, loans, and economic policies dictated by foreign powers and international financial institutions. The very essence of sovereignty, the right of a nation to govern itself, to make decisions in the best interests of its people, has been undermined by a global economic system that privileges the interests of wealthy countries and multinational corporations. It is time for the nations of the Global South to reclaim their sovereignty and assert their right to determine their own paths to development. Sovereignty over development is not just a matter of political independence, it is a fundamental human right, a right to control one's economic future and to shape a vision of progress that is aligned with the needs, aspirations, and values of the people. The development strategies imposed upon nations in the Global South have often been driven by external actors who have little regard for local contexts, needs, or priorities. Institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, while ostensibly designed to support development, have historically played a central role in imposing one-size-fits-all solutions. These solutions, often framed as structural adjustments or austerity measures, have had devastating consequences for millions of people in developing nations. By dictating policies that prioritize debt repayment, free market liberalization, and privatization, these institutions have disregarded the unique economic, social, and cultural realities of the countries they are meant to help. Rather than fostering sustainable, inclusive growth, these policies have often entrenched inequality, undermined public services, and worsened poverty. Countries in the Global South have been forced to implement economic reforms that benefit external creditors and multinational corporations, but fail to provide tangible benefits to their own citizens. Public health systems have been gutted, education systems underfunded, and local industries undermined by cheap imports and global competition. Union. The result is a perpetuation of economic dependence, where nations are trapped in a cycle of borrowing, repaying, and borrowing again, often with little to show for it in terms of tangible improvements in living standards or social well-being. This situation is not only unjust, it is unsustainable. Nations in the global south are no longer willing to accept policies that serve the interests of foreign creditors and multinational corporations at the expense of their own citizens. Sovereignty over development is about more than just political independence. It is about the right to chart one's own course, to make decisions that reflect the needs and priorities of the people, and to refuse to be subject to external pressures that undermine national sovereignty and self-determination. It is time for countries in the global south to take charge of their own futures and demand the freedom to design development strategies that are tailored to their unique circumstances. The demand for sovereignty over development means rejecting the notion that economic growth must be dictated by foreign investors or international financial institutions. It means prioritizing policies that focus on social welfare, equity, and sustainability, instead of following the prescriptions of the IMF or World Bank, which often prioritize debt repayment and austerity measures. Nations in the global south must have the freedom to invest in their own people. This includes investing in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and sustainable industries, policies that provide long-term benefits and create a more equitable society for all citizens. The focus must shift from short-term fiscal targets to long-term sustainable growth that takes into account the welfare of future generations. This sovereignty also requires the ability to protect local industries and promote economic diversification. Too often, countries in the global south are forced to open their markets to global competition without adequate protections for their local industries. This has led to the collapse of small-scale agriculture, manufacturing, and other local sectors that are vital to the economic fabric of these nations. Instead of relying on raw material exports or low-wage labor, countries must be free to invest in industries that can provide long-term employment opportunities, enhance technological capacity, and build resilient economies. Sovereignty over development means creating the conditions for local industries to thrive, ensuring that they are not undercut by cheap imports or foreign-controlled enterprises. The demand for sovereignty over development also means challenging the global financial system that often forces developing nations into debt traps. The current system of international lending, particularly through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, frequently forces countries to take on unsustainable levels of debt. This debt burden is often accompanied by harsh conditions, such as austerity measures, that further harm the people of these nations. Sovereignty over development includes the freedom to manage debt responsibly, to negotiate fairer terms, and to seek debt relief when necessary without the heavy hand of foreign creditors dictating the terms. Nations should have the right to pursue policies that allow them to invest in their own development without being shackled by crippling debt payments that drain vital resources from essential public services. Furthermore, sovereignty over development involves the right to protect and manage natural resources in ways that benefit local communities. Many nations in the global south are rich in natural resources, yet these resources are often extracted by multinational corporations that reap the profits, leaving local populations with little benefit. Sovereignty means having the right to manage and control these resources in a way that supports national development goals, respects environmental sustainability, and ensures that the wealth generated from natural resources is used to improve the well-being of the people. Ultimately, the demand for sovereignty over development is about reclaiming control over the future. It is about rejecting the status quo that has kept the global south in a position of dependency and subjugation. Countries in the global south must not be passive recipients of external dictates, but active architects of their own futures. They must have the freedom to make decisions that serve their own interests and to chart their own paths towards sustainable, inclusive growth. Sovereignty over development is not a luxury. It is a necessity for creating a more just, equitable, and prosperous world. It is time for the nations of the global south to claim their rightful place in shaping the future, not as subordinates to foreign powers, but as leaders in their own development. The current debt burden on developing nations is a critical issue that demands urgent attention. For years, countries in the global south have been trapped in a vicious cycle of borrowing, repayment, and further borrowing, with little to show for it in terms of tangible improvements in living standards or long-term development. The sheer weight of debt, much of it incurred under terms that heavily favor international creditors, is strangling the ability of these nations to invest in their future. Instead of being a tool for development, debt has become a mechanism that perpetuates inequality, limits economic growth, and constrains governments' ability to provide basic services to their people. The time has come for a new approach to lending and debt management, one that is fair, transparent, and in alignment with the long-term development goals of the countries that bear the greatest burden. Debt should not be a tool for perpetuating inequality, yet that is exactly what it has become for many nations in the global south. The terms under which loans are extended often do not take into account the economic realities of developing countries. High interest rates, short repayment periods, and stringent conditions such as austerity measures or market liberalization are imposed without regard for the social consequences. These policies do not only exacerbate financial instability, they lead to the deterioration of public services, deepening poverty, and increasing inequality. When governments are forced to divert public resources to debt repayments, they have less money to invest in essential services, such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social welfare. This creates a situation where the debt burden harms the very people it is supposed to help, often those who are already the most vulnerable in society. Furthermore, much of the debt that developing countries incur is tied to the interests of foreign creditors, particularly large multinational financial institutions. These institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Bank, and private lenders, are often more concerned with protecting their financial interests than ensuring the economic well-being of the countries that are indebted to them. This system is inherently unjust. It transfers the responsibility for repaying the debt onto the citizens of developing nations, who bear the cost of decisions made by governments in times of economic crisis or during periods of political instability. Instead of contributing to sustainable development, debt repayments simply benefit foreign lenders, who remain insulated from the economic suffering experienced by the debtor nations. The current system also places countries in the global south in a precarious position, where they are forced to prioritize debt repayments over investment in critical areas such as healthcare, education, and social development. As debt obligations grow, countries are left with little choice but to implement austerity measures that further reduce public spending and economic opportunity. This vicious cycle of borrowing and repayment keeps developing nations in a perpetual state of vulnerability, unable to break free from the shackles of external debt. The pressure to meet international debt obligations often results in the underfunding of critical public services, which directly impacts the well-being of citizens and hinders the ability of nations to invest in their long-term development. What is needed now is a new approach to debt that takes into account the social and economic realities of the countries in question. Fairer lending terms are a critical part of this process. Debt should be viewed not as a punitive measure, but as a tool to support sustainable development and growth. Lenders must recognize that for many nations in the global south, the ability to repay loans is not a matter of will, but of capacity. Rather than imposing high interest rates and short repayment periods, loans should be extended with terms that allow developing countries the breathing space they need to grow their economies, reduce poverty, and improve social conditions. This means longer repayment periods, lower interest rates, and more flexible conditions that are aligned with the development goals of the borrowing nation. In addition to fairer lending terms, comprehensive debt restructuring is essential to address the unsustainable debt burdens faced by many countries in the global south. Debt restructuring involves renegotiating the terms of existing loans, often with the goal of reducing the overall debt burden or extending the repayment period to make the debt more manageable. However, restructuring should not simply focus on financial terms. It must also consider the social and economic consequences of the debt. Debt restructuring should be carried out in a way that prioritizes the needs of the people, ensuring that the country has the resources it needs to invest in essential services and development projects that benefit society as a whole. The restructuring process must be transparent, inclusive, and designed in consultation with all relevant stakeholders. Governments, civil society, and the citizens whose lives will be affected by the outcome. Debt relief should also be considered as a critical part of this new approach. Many countries in the Global South are faced with unmanageable debt loads that simply cannot be repaid without undermining their ability to achieve their development goals. In such cases, debt forgiveness or partial debt cancellation should be part of the conversation. Debt relief is not just a matter of economic fairness. It is an essential step toward creating the conditions for long-term growth and stability in developing countries. By alleviating the debt burden, countries will be able to redirect resources toward investments in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and other key areas of development that will help break the cycle of poverty and inequality. Ultimately, the goal should be to create a global financial system that supports the development of all nations, rather than one that perpetuates inequality and dependence. Debt should be a means of empowering countries in the Global South, not a tool for maintaining their subjugation to foreign creditors. By implementing fairer lending terms, offering comprehensive debt restructuring, and considering debt relief when necessary, the international community can help create a financial environment that fosters sustainable growth, reduces poverty, and promotes social and economic justice. The time has come for a paradigm shift in the way debt is managed and structured. The current system is unsustainable and unjust. It is time for the global community to work together to create a financial system that prioritizes the well-being of people, not profits, and that supports the development of nations, not their continued indebtedness. The future of the Global South depends on the ability to manage debt in a way that fosters growth, creates opportunities, and enables people to thrive, not a future where debt continues to be a barrier to progress. For decades, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has played a pivotal role in shaping the economic policies of countries in the Global South. Yet, its influence has been marked by an often top-down approach, with nations forced to adhere to externally imposed solutions, frequently in the form of austerity measures and structural adjustments. These policies have often led to harmful consequences: rising inequality, economic instability, and social unrest. The IMF's approach has inadvertently reinforced the very cycles of poverty and dependency that it purports to address. The time has come for the IMF to evolve from a distant authority imposing one-size-fits-all solutions into a true partner for countries seeking sustainable development. Such a shift is necessary not only to repair the IMF's strained relationship with the Global South, but also to ensure that economic policies are tailored to the specific needs and aspirations of individual countries, fostering long-term prosperity for all. Historically, the IMF has often been seen by developing nations as an external force that imposes its will on sovereign states. Its traditional role has involved dictating the terms of loans and financial assistance, often tying these to the implementation of specific economic policies. These policies have typically emphasized fiscal austerity, reduction of government spending, deregulation of markets, and liberalization of trade, all aimed at stabilizing the economy in the short term. However, while these measures may achieve some level of financial stability, they often come at a high social cost. Austerity measures, in particular, have led to deep cuts in public services such as healthcare and education, increased unemployment, and worsened poverty levels. These policies, rather than fostering economic resilience, have often left countries in a perpetual state of economic vulnerability, unable to invest in long-term growth or development. A shift away from this top-down, one-size-fits-all approach is crucial. Instead of continuing to impose rigid, standardized policies, the IMF must evolve into a more inclusive, collaborative partner for countries seeking to achieve sustainable and inclusive development. This requires a fundamental change in the way the IMF operates. The The institution must transition from acting as a creditor enforcing conditions to becoming a facilitator of tailored, context-sensitive solutions. Each country has its own unique economic, social, and political challenges, and it is essential that the IMF recognizes these differences and works with nations to craft policies that reflect their specific needs. This would involve moving beyond the imposition of cookie-cutter economic reforms and engaging in meaningful dialogue with national governments, civil society, and other stakeholders. The IMF must listen to the unique challenges that each nation faces, acknowledging the historical, social, and structural factors that contribute to their economic difficulties. For example, many countries in the Global South are burdened by the legacy of colonialism, resource extraction, and political instability, issues that cannot be addressed by simply cutting public spending or opening up markets. These nations require more than just financial assistance. They need a partner that understands their context and can offer solutions that take into account their historical challenges. By working together with governments to understand the roots of their economic problems, the IMF can help craft policies that are more likely to succeed in the long term. Furthermore, the IMF should play a role in fostering development policies that prioritize sustainable growth, economic diversification, and social welfare. Many countries in the Global South are heavily dependent on a narrow range of industries or raw material exports, leaving them vulnerable to global price fluctuations and external shocks. The IMF can assist in developing strategies that promote economic diversification, supporting sectors such as technology, agriculture, and green energy. It can also help countries build resilient economic systems that are better equipped to withstand global economic crises. The focus must shift from short-term stabilization toward long-term prosperity. To this end, the IMF should support initiatives that invest in infrastructure, human capital, and innovation, creating the conditions for sustained economic development. Moreover, the IMF must embrace a more democratic and inclusive decision-making process, where the voices of the countries it serves are genuinely heard and considered. Currently, the IMF is often criticized for its governance structure, which is heavily influenced by wealthy countries, particularly the United States and European nations. This imbalance in power has led to policies that disproportionately benefit the interests of rich countries and multinational corporations, while neglecting the needs of poorer nations. A more inclusive approach would ensure that the voices of developing nations are given equal weight in shaping the global financial system. This can be achieved by reforming the IMF's governance structure, ensuring that decisions are made through a more democratic process that reflects the interests of all its members, regardless of their economic power. A true partnership between the IMF and the countries it serves would involve mutual respect and shared responsibility. The IMF should not view itself as an outside authority, but as a collaborative partner that works alongside governments to strengthen their economies. This would require a shift in the institution's mindset, from seeing its role as one of oversight and control to one of facilitation and support. The IMF should assist countries in strengthening their own institutions, such as their financial, legal, and governance systems, so that they can become more self-sufficient and resilient over time. This would be a more empowering approach, enabling countries to make their own decisions and pursue their own development agendas while still benefiting from the IMF's expertise and resources. Furthermore, the IMF must work to ensure that its policies do not exacerbate inequality or social unrest. Structural adjustments and austerity measures have often been implemented without sufficient consideration of their social impacts, leading to widespread suffering among vulnerable populations. Instead, the IMF should place a greater emphasis on policies that reduce inequality, promote social inclusion, and protect vulnerable groups. This means supporting countries in their efforts to invest in education, healthcare, and social protection, which are essential for building a more equitable and just society. Development cannot be achieved without addressing the social dimensions of poverty and inequality. In conclusion, the IMF must evolve into a true partner for nations seeking sustainable development, shifting away from its traditional top-down, one-size-fits-all approach. By collaborating with countries, listening to their unique challenges, and working together on tailored solutions, The IMF can help foster long-term prosperity for all. This requires a fundamental change in the institution's approach, one that emphasizes inclusivity, democracy, and respect for national sovereignty. Only through this transformation can the IMF fulfill its true potential as a partner in global development, helping nations in the global south achieve their economic goals while ensuring social and environmental sustainability. For far too long, the global economic system has been dominated by the wealthiest nations, whose policies and decisions have shaped the trajectory of global development at the expense of the global south. This imbalance has resulted in a world where economic power and prosperity are concentrated in a few countries, while much of the global south remains marginalized, impoverished, and dependent. The future of global economic stability cannot rest solely on the shoulders of the wealthiest nations. It must be a shared responsibility that includes the voices, needs, and contributions of all countries, particularly those in the global south. Empowering these nations is not just a moral imperative, it is essential for creating a more stable, equitable, and prosperous world for everyone. The term Global South refers to countries that are often characterized by lower income levels, historical legacies of colonization, and political and economic systems that have been shaped by external forces. These nations are home to some of the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations, yet they also represent enormous untapped potential. The resources, talent, and creativity of the Global South are crucial to addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing humanity, from climate change to economic inequality. However, for these nations to fully realize their potential, they must be empowered with the tools and resources they need to take control of their own development. One of the most pressing ways to empower the Global South is through inclusive policies that prioritize the needs and aspirations of these nations. For decades, global economic policies have been shaped by the priorities of wealthy countries, with little regard for the specific circumstances of the Global South. The policies of international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank have often been imposed in a top-down fashion, with little consultation or input from the countries they affect. These policies have frequently focused on austerity, privatization, and market liberalization, measures that have disproportionately harmed the most vulnerable populations in the Global South. Rather than empowering nations to achieve sustainable development, these policies have entrenched inequality, undermined social services, and perpetuated economic dependency. To truly empower the Global South, the international community must adopt policies that recognize and respect the unique challenges and opportunities faced by these nations. These policies must be shaped by the priorities of the people and governments in the Global South, not dictated from above. This requires a shift away from the traditional model of development that has often relied on external aid and intervention, and towards a model that is based on self-determination and collaboration. Nations in the Global South must have the freedom to design their own development strategies, with the support of the global community that are tailored to their specific needs and circumstances. Fair trade is another crucial element of empowering the Global South. The current global trading system has been designed to benefit wealthier nations, with developing countries often relegated to the role of raw material suppliers or low-wage laborers. The terms of trade have historically been skewed against the Global South, with these nations facing barriers to accessing global markets, receiving low prices for their exports, and dealing with unfair trade practices. This has resulted in a situation where many countries in the Global South are trapped in cycles of poverty, unable to break free from their dependence on exports of raw materials and commodities. Fair trade offers a more just and equitable alternative. By ensuring that developing countries have access to global markets on fair terms, fair trade can help to level the playing field. This means ensuring that countries in the Global South can export their goods at fair prices without being exploited by multinational corporations or facing unfair tariffs. It also involves creating trade policies that promote the development of local industries rather than undermining them through cheap imports. Fair trade is not just about better prices for goods. It is about ensuring that countries in the Global South have the opportunity to diversify their economies, build local industries, and create long-term economic stability. By promoting fair trade, the international community can empower nations in the global south to grow their economies sustainably and reduce their dependence on external assistance. Another critical component of empowering the global south is economic justice. The current global economic system is deeply unjust, with wealth and resources concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy nations and multinational corporations, while much of the global south remains mired in poverty. The wealthiest countries often extract resources from developing nations without fair compensation, and multinational corporations exploit cheap labor while contributing little to the local. In order to create a more just global economic system, the voices of the global south must be heard, and the policies of wealthy countries must be re-examined. Economic justice involves creating a system in which the wealth generated by global trade and investment is more fairly distributed. This can be achieved through fairer international trade agreements, the regulation of multinational corporations to ensure they pay fair wages and contribute to local economies, and the promotion of sustainable development practices that protect both people and the planet. Additionally, it involves addressing the issue of debt. Many countries in the global south are burdened by unsustainable levels of debt, which have been accumulated over decades of borrowing under terms that favor external creditors. Debt restructuring and relief are essential for enabling these nations to redirect resources toward development rather than being trapped in a cycle of debt repayment that stifles growth and perpetuates poverty. Empowering the global south is not just a matter of fairness. It is essential for global economic stability. In today's interconnected world, the stability and prosperity of one region cannot be separated from the well-being of others. The economic challenges facing the global south are not isolated problems, they have global implications. Climate change, global pandemics, migration, and trade imbalances all affect both the global south and the wealthier nations. A more equitable global economic system, one that includes the voices and needs of the global south, will not only improve the lives of people in developing nations, but will also create a more stable, prosperous world for all. In conclusion, empowering the global south is essential for building a more just, stable, and prosperous global economy. This requires adopting inclusive policies that prioritize the needs of developing nations, promoting fair trade practices, and ensuring economic justice for all. The future of global economic stability depends on the active participation and contributions of all nations, not just the wealthiest ones. By empowering the global south, we can create a more equitable and sustainable world for future generations.